Hello and welcome to the 35th episode of the Special Needs Voice podcast. My name is Aaron. Our goal with this podcast is simple: to share the stories and perspectives from the top leaders in our special needs community. By the conclusion of each episode, we hope you have laughed at least once, learned something new, and are better equipped to handle your next challenge. Today, Mike Walther, founder and president of Wealth Advisors, will be speaking with Dr. Tim Vogus. Dr. Vogus is a Brownlee Currey Jr. Professor of Management at Vanderbilt University, where he also serves as faculty director of the Leadership Development Program and deputy director of the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation. Motivated by his son Aidan's autism diagnosis, Dr. Vogus has dedicated his research to advancing neurodiversity inclusion in healthcare and workplace settings. His recent publication, Overcoming the Double Empathy Problem, is essential for the importance of mutual understanding between neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals. In this episode, Dr. Vogus shares insights from his research and offers practical, effective ways to strengthen connection and understanding.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Mike Walther, founder and president of Wealth Advisors. I'm so happy to bring to you today Dr. Tim Vogus. Tim is the Brownlee Currey Jr. Professor of Management at the Owen Graduate School of Management at Vanderbilt University, as well as the faculty director of the Leadership Development Program and the deputy director of Business Innovations for the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, also at Vanderbilt University. Well, the interesting thing about Dr. Vogus is that his research covers the gamut, but he's got a special interest in autism and sharing more about his personal and professional experience with those in the autism community. And so maybe, Tim, we can start with a discussion about the double empathy theory, something I didn't really understand very well. I'd heard it before, but having recently read your paper, found it very interesting. Can you kind of summarize that for us?
Absolutely. So the double empathy theory, double empathy problem comes from an autistic sociologist in the UK named Damien Milton. And to give you a little context around that, I'd probably take a brief step back. So the reason why a double empathy kind of problem comes up is because historically and inaccurately, people have viewed autistic people as lacking empathy or having a quote unquote weak theory of mind, an inability to understand others. What Damien Milton helps illuminate is that it's not autistic people cannot understand others. It's a fact that we have different types of minds. A neurotypical and a neurodivergent brain are different, right? People pay attention to different things. They communicate in different kind of ways, maybe interpret the social world and the sensory world in different kinds of ways. So what a double empathy perspective says is not one person lacks empathy while another person has it. It's there's a breakdown in mutual understanding. So an autistic person might struggle to understand a neurotypical person, but a neurotypical person is going to, at the same time, probably struggle to understand an autistic person because people are having different experiences, even in the same kind of environment.
Wow. Well, thank you for summarizing that much more clearly than I probably could ever try to do. So with all the different leadership exposures you have on the Vanderbilt campus, what led you to your interest in autism and autism research?
Yeah. So I've been an active kind of autism researcher probably for the past 8 years, but I've been doing a lot of research on autism and neurodiversity since my son was about 2.5. So my son Aidan is now 23. So he was diagnosed as autistic at that point in his life. So I've been learning a lot about it. So I've been trying to figure out, he has also had some complex medical conditions with seizures and other kinds of things. So all my research really over the course of the past 2+ decades has been in the first stage, thinking about how to make healthcare organizations safer and more effective. And that was to create conditions where I thought he could get the kind of care that he would deserve in those contexts. And then, subsequent to that, it was about how do we make the world more inclusive and more open and more welcoming of people whose brains process the world in a different way than the typical kind of person. So how do we make it more neuro-inclusive? So it was really kind of, a lot of times people will say research is me search. And in my case, that tends to be pretty true because I was really trying to solve what I, use the tools of as a kind of organizational researcher to think about how do we make organizational cultures so that healthcare organizations are safer, and then subsequently so that workplaces, schools, other kinds of environments are more welcoming of neurodiversity.
That's amazing. It's great to know there's people like you out there who are really looking at what can an organization do to be more inclusive, to be more thoughtful, and to create greater safety for those who need it in different areas, not just those with an autism diagnosis.
Right. Yeah, because the contrast a lot of times is right, like it's incumbent upon the individual. So a lot of times it would be, so who needs to adapt? That autistic person, right? Like you just need to fit in and figure out how to mask and minimize, kind of who you are, in order to fit in the box. And the same is true, and obviously in healthcare organizations too, right? Like, so how do we be safer? Be safer as an individual rather than make safer systems.
Interesting. So it's kind of one of those examples of the double empathy problem where instead of trying to fix the person you think needs to be fixed, maybe you should look internally and say, what can we do to be more accepting and more understanding of the situation?
That's right. Recognize that it's a breakdown on both parties. So, okay, now that it's broken down, guess what? It's incumbent upon both of us. It's our mutual responsibility to bring it back together, right?
Interesting.
Figure out how do we create context for that.
So in your recent paper, Creating a Neuro-Inclusive Profession, Overcoming the Double Empathy Problem, you actually share some personal revelations in your research about how you're maybe seeing your son differently now as a 20-year-old than you saw him as a young child. Can you maybe share some things that have changed in your perspective about raising a young person with a diagnosis?
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of it comes from a well-intentioned place, as I try to articulate in the paper too, is, when you get a diagnosis of a young child, you're told right away, you need to get engaged in these kind of activities that can help, right? Early intervention is essential, not disputing that as a reality. But I think what happened for me, as I reflect on it now, and even some in the course of his youth, I think I was so fixated on, as Vogus, who's kind of one of the founders of applied behavior analysis, talks about, making Aidan indistinguishable from his neurotypical peers, right? Like, and the focus became the goal rather than understanding him, right? Like it was about using the techniques and the tools to make it so he's indistinguishable, he's progressing in the same way his peers are. And in doing that, it damaged, upon reflection, especially in relation to how we relate to each other now, damaged the relationship, because everything was about, hey, I'm not just going to be your dad. I've got to be the person we're doing these tasks and we're doing these discrete trial things. You've got to learn this stuff. We got to get caught up. And it just, it squeezed out all the space for the real human connection. So the double empathy problem was there too, right? And it was there because I was so focused on my way of being and living is the right way. So he needs to become more like me. So I'm imposing my view. And then on his side, he's not understanding what I want and why I want it because he's just being himself. Right. Like, so there was just that disconnect there, but there was such a power imbalance, right? Like as a parent to a young child, he's just got to come along with me. And there was just more disagreement and acrimony than there needed to be. And I even realized, in going through this and then starting to research autism more fully, I even realized how in my own research that I was making the similar kind of errors in what I was saying organizations should do. What is better practice? So I told you some of my work was in healthcare organizations. And in looking at that, one of the things that I emphasized to make healthcare organizations safer was you should select people for their interpersonal skills as well as their social skills, which is a sensible recommendation, right? Like you want doctors and nurses who can communicate to catch things and so people feel safe to speak up about something going wrong.
Sure.
That's fine. But what I was doing at the same time is saying social skills equal neurotypical social skills, right? Like, so you're imposing that kind of view. So it's kind of reinforcing the things that served as barriers for Aidan too. So I realized that a lot of the research in my field was unknowingly imposing these very neurotypical visions of leadership and communication and workplace relationships that can really serve as barriers. So that's how the personal kind of reflected back on my professional. And now I write and think a little bit differently.
It's kind of amazing how things kind of, I don't want to say come full circle, but I think back to my brother 50 years ago, who didn't have an autism diagnosis until he's 32 because autism wasn't diagnosable back in the 70s. But my parents raised us very similarly. I had different abilities than my brother had, but there wasn't all these therapies and treatments and different courses of action to take once you get a diagnosis that you have today. And maybe that benefited my brother because he wasn't spending all this time having stuff forced upon him that he wasn't going to understand or didn't understand the why behind doing it.
Exactly.
And maybe we've gone through that heavy dosage of you have to do it this way, you have to change, to what you just stated, which is, what the newest thinking is, maybe both sides need to change. Maybe both sides need to understand each other better. And how do we help create that bridge so that both parties are able to better understand and better communicate and have a more successful relationship, whether it's a parent to a child or an organization to a group of people they're working with?
Yeah. Couldn't agree more with all of that. I think that's a really nice distillation of it, a nice way to think about it. And one of the things is kind of, what makes that hard in a way is we kind of have to unlearn some of our own thinking traps, right? Because we're always constantly engaged in this kind of attempt to mind read the other people with whom we're engaging. And maybe if we just take a pause from that a little bit and say, you know what, whatever I'm projecting onto this person might be completely inaccurate. How about I ask them what they actually think? How about I step back for a minute and listen? And I think we can get a lot farther maybe doing some of that.
I think that also applies to us as financial advisors. If we're doing our job correctly, we're actually asking more questions than we are getting answers.
Yep.
Trying to learn more about the other side and what they need.
Yep.
From the paper itself, you didn't talk much about that yet, but I'd like you to. You've obviously expanded from your personal experience with Aidan to how it impacts organizations. So what could you share with our audience about maybe what they could take back to their organization to be more effective in working with the neurodivergent community?
Absolutely. I think there are several things that people can do. I think you can rethink and kind of reimagine a little bit. Reimagine might sound overly grandiose, but just rethink a little bit, some of the everyday practices that go on inside organizations. So one thing might be like interviewing. So when you do that, what can you do to help set people who might be neurodivergent up for success? So we know that those kind of social situations can be high anxiety, high stress, and it might be amplified even more among autistic job candidates, especially, but neurodivergent folks more generally. So what can you do? You can maybe send those interview questions in advance. If you want somebody to, really be prepared and to be able to demonstrate what they can do rather than just trying to trick them by stressing somebody out in the course of an interview. If you see somebody getting stuck in a question, maybe prompting. So there's been some good research to show that just kind of breaking down a question. Hey, I'm going to ask you about your strengths. Here's what I mean by strengths. Can you give me an example of a strength that when you use it, if somebody gets stuck? So here's what I'm asking for, right? Like kind of giving somebody, getting them back on track, helping them get in and out of their answers. And this is practice you can apply to anybody, but it's especially helpful in the context of neurodivergence. And I also think some of the things that we might ignore in those contexts would be helpful. So if somebody's not making eye contact, that doesn't mean they're not listening to you. That doesn't mean they're disinterested. I have a good friend who's autistic, and she says that I can either look at you or hear what you're saying. It's your choice, right? Because if I'm looking at you, I'm using all my cognitive effort to just look at your face and to know that I'm doing that. So like things like that, things like fidgeting or maybe needing to stand up or pace or whatever, right? Like things that are unrelated to the job. Maybe we don't emphasize those kind of things as much because body language and eye contact are things that often get evaluated in job interviews, even though they might have nothing at all to do with the job. Another thing that can be really helpful is when people are joining teams, new teams at work. I've found a real helpful tool that a company called the Ultranauts uses, and I use it in my courses at Owen, is something called a personal user manual. So when people join a new team, they write up a little one-pager that says, here's how I communicate. Here's what people tell me I need to work on. Here's my pet peeves. So just kind of going through and laying out how I work effectively. And then everybody else in the team shares the same. And then that's a starting point for a real conversation about how we can work together, knowing those things that maybe we each need to work on, maybe those things we do well, maybe those ways we prefer communicating, rather than having to learn it and guess it over time. So that's another simple thing that I think people can do. And one other thing, this is especially true for leaders or managers in organizations. I think clarity about expectations and behavioral feedback, what you observe, when you observe it, what you'd like to see differently. That's on the feedback side. Clarity of expectations is really important. So I did some research on this with Valerie Martin up in Montreal, and we looked at 9 autistic employees, 9 managers, 9 job coaches, and we followed them over time. And what we observed with these folks is that oftentimes, consistent with the double empathy problem, managers would have one set of expectations that they would often not state. And they were often relational expectations for, hey, are you smiling enough? Do you seem to be enjoying your work? Are you interacting with me in a jokey kind of way? Whereas the autistic employees, as you might expect, were evaluating what they were doing. Am I doing my tasks and am I doing them well? So what you had was oftentimes this big gap where people would be doing great on their tasks, poor on the undefined version of the manager's view of what appropriate relationships were between boss and subordinate, and people would get lower evaluations. And what other interesting thing that we found in that paper was even for employees who had it worked out with one manager, where they were doing great, they had specified the relationship, specified the tasks, and it was going great. When the manager changed, if they did not reset the expectations with clarity, things fell apart. So we had one employee in our study who went from the best employee to getting fired because the manager changed, never reset the expectations. So like these are all just basic things, right? Like they weren't costly interventions. Like a user manual is zero cost. It's giving people 10 minutes to kind of write up a one pager. Interviewing, it's just kind of restructuring slightly expectations and feedback. It's just being clearer about what you want and thinking more holistically, and not saying a good employee is somebody who can guess my intentions, but it's somebody who I can, convey those to, and they do them, they take them into account.
That's amazing. Can you share with the audience from what you've seen in your research and your partnerships about how corporate America is grasping onto those concepts? Is it becoming more commonplace? You're seeing in organizations that they're thinking along those lines to really set expectations better and have better communication between managers and staff?
I think that is still an area for development, but I do think a lot of organizations are very interested. And I think in recent weeks, I've done with three different corporate headquarters where there were groups interested in neurodiversity and how to do more with it. So I do think there's a lot of interest. And I think what I've gotten positive feedback about is I think companies are really interested, not necessarily in starting new targeted hiring initiatives, but instead thinking about how can we reimagine our existing processes that makes it easier for people who are already in our organization who might be neurodivergent to actually disclose, and that's not held against anybody, right? Like, make it a safe place for that kind of disclosure. And also thinking about how can we do the kinds of things that we were just talking through about interviews and expectations and feedback and onboarding, because every time I present on this kind of thing or teach a class on it is, everybody in the room goes, yeah, that's just better management. Right? Like that's a better organization that I would like to be a part of. So I think that's what people are starting to grab hold of and saying, we have more neurodiversity in our workplace already than we think we do. So why don't we just create conditions where that neurodiversity can thrive and flourish? Because we're in a complex world right now. So we need all these different types of minds in order to kind of meet the challenges of the day.
That's awesome. I think that was one of the takeaways I heard. I'm sure our listeners heard it too, is the changes that corporate America and just broader communities or groups of people need to have happen are just basic good practices. And by the way, they're going to really help communication with the neurodivergent community and other communities that maybe aren't being heard as well, or maybe communicate differently.
Yep, exactly. And even just thinking about this, like all this kind of explicit stuff and about rethinking these kind of social dynamics, if you're just a shy person, right? Sure. Like, or a quiet person, right? Like, because a lot of what we valorize in business school are the kind of transformational leader and, somebody who's a very charismatic person, but that's not the only way to lead. That's a way, right?
Absolutely. So maybe we can close with you sharing with the community of listeners recommendations that they could take back when they're talking with other people who they want to educate on this topic or want to have a greater understanding of how better to communicate with their loved one or the people they're supporting.
I think I'm going to try to distill this to some real simple practice.
Awesome.
Okay. So I think, the things that I've taken away from my experience as a parent, now as a researcher, and also, teach an elective course about neurodiversity in the workplace, right? Like from doing all those different things, I think the things that are most important are assuming less, right? So that idea of mind reading, not doing that, just assuming less about what other people's intentions and motives are. What we were talking about already with listening more, I think that's absolutely essential. And then staying open to the possibility that there might be a different kind of process that you might need to go through in order to work effectively with somebody who is different from you in any number of ways, right? Like, so staying open to that, to recognizing there's not one best way. And then the last thing would be laying it out. When you have an intention, when you have something that's a preference, when you have an expectation, make it explicit. Don't make people guess. and infer from you, because you're assuming that everybody thinks like you, and they do not. So if there's something that is important to you, give the other person the opportunity to respond to it by letting them know what you want and need, and then being open to receiving the same from them.
Tim, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I've got a feeling that this podcast can become required listening for all future Oak Wealth Advisors employees, because I really want all of us to really implement everything you just shared and be better at what we do with all the families we're interacting with. So thank you so much for that. And I think, I'm going to take away the last thing you just said, staying open to the possibility and thinking about what that means broadly. Like, what can we all do? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as a community to make things better for everyone? So I really do appreciate your time today and sharing all this insight with the world. Thank you, Tim.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Please refer to the show notes on how to connect with Dr. Vogus. If you would like to suggest a guest for a future podcast, please email me at aaron@oakwealth.com. See you next time.